Good afternoon, Cassi. It's a real pleasure to be in conversation with you today. This is your second show, if I'm correct, right, at the Xavier Hufkens Gallery here in Brussels. And as usual, the show has a beautiful title. So it's The Equator's Forfeit. Is it how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
And the whole series of paintings, right, are all informed by this idea. And I wanted to start by asking you, what is it that you found interesting or that spoke to you, with this idea of the equator? Because I think this is an interest that we share also about what the equator can do for our imaginary.
I thought about the equator. I had spent some time in Senegal at the Josef and Anni residency. And I started thinking about life in the equatorial line and maybe these like shared experiences, these sort of human experiences, but then thinking about this like invisible line and maybe incorporating this realm of magical realism and then also wanting to tell a sub-Saharan African story. And also thinking about this idea of an invisible line and then the idea of just time in general, and that, in the West, we think about time in a very linear way, which also feels like very made up. And then wanting to kind of bend that, because I think in African life, thinking about these shared ideas around life, time, spirituality is sort of what I was exploring within the idea of the equator, and then also the realities around those shared experiences climate-wise, these like kind of shifting patterns that are happening along sub-Saharan Africa. For instance, in Mozambique, every year around the rain season, there's a kind of tragedy or catastrophe that happens with the weather patterns.
Mm-hmm. So you have at the same time the potential to sort of re-poeticize places, but of course this idea of forfeit is also the idea of losing something, of something which is about to be lost. So I think it's a very powerful idea that you feel in the middle of these two different things, right? And I think it's part of the beauty of this title.
Yeah, I was again thinking about like how patterns are changing, and then thinking about post-colonial African life, and the idea of a forfeit is to be at a loss. This idea of gain and loss and these sort of natural patterns, and then also like human experiences that exist around a forfeit, to release oneself. So there is this kind of romantic notion, and then things that are also out of our control.
We've seen a huge resurgence of, Black figuration in the last years, a big appetite. And I think your work does something very different from what we've seen. And I wanted to ask you how you saw your work in relation to this, larger Black figuration. Also because I see something different. I see also a sort of manifesto of freedom also in the way you figure Black, characters. So I wanted to hear you a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the way the figure can exist within the frame of a landscape. Within all the paintings, place is really important. Time also is really large part of the quality of the painting, where one could maybe recognize or question the time of the day or the place, and whether what kind of weather it might be. I like to leave a lot of imagination to the viewer. So the figure actually sometimes is not even important. Maybe they're a little bit blurred. I think like when we look at Terrestrial Reckoning, it's a woman that she's in action, she's walking through a graveyard, but there's so much more detail to it. So I'm not so interested in really enveloping character. I am interested in creating a human story, and that in which we can all relate to. So we have Mangito's way of life, it's a young boy thatching a roof, And it could be his home, or it could be a neighbor's home. Maybe he's getting a little currency for it. So I'm interested in ideas around trade, around union, around human suffering, and how urban landscapes can support experiences, and as well as rural landscapes. In that way, I can tell a global story, a universal story, and everyone can connect. And that connection is really important for me. They're never really connecting to the audience. We're outside looking in and maybe yearning to connect. So that's something that I also like to navigate within making painting.
That's interesting that you mentioned that. It's true that they do not seem concerned with the gaze that's being posed upon them, right? So I wanted to ask you about this very specific and distinctive color palette that you have in your work, how you came to this choice of colors, and also you were telling me how you apply them, and I'm curious to hear you more about this.
Typically, I start with a canvas, and I don't like to paint onto white canvas, so I do a wash, of color, and then I let the wash of the color maybe inform the next palette. I work usually within a strict set of colors, 4, sometimes 5, and then I paint usually all at once. I'm never just working one singular painting at a time. It's almost like as if I'm puzzle piecing. I have to go back to the Albers residency because this was the year that last year, in April last year, I spent time in Connecticut, where there's the Albers archive. And then I started to sort of think about my own language around color. I was wanting to navigate some sort of polarity within the palette, and thinking about cool and warm contrast. And I never wanted to make just a cool painting or just a warm painting, but I wanted to make a disenchanting painting or enchanting painting, something that feels both have the realm of some kind of magical realism or set in like a different reality.
It really contributes to this idea of re-enchanting, and I've also heard mention, in relation to your work, the notion of magic realism, which is a movement that we usually associate with Latin America or literature in Latin America. I wanted to ask you how you see this magical realism in conversation with your work. Is it something that you recognize yourself?
Surely. Essentially, when I'm making a body of work, I'm always telling some kind of story. I like to think about painting as like cinematic frames, even within the title of the painting, that even the painting could exist on its own, and it's a painting of a world in itself. And then they connect to, the larger narrative. But in terms of magical realism, I think, I was born in Maputo. I lived in Maputo for 3 years, but then I moved quite a bit. We left to Indonesia and Kenya, and constantly readapting. And then when I moved back to Mozambique, I was in my early 20s, and I was a foreigner in a place that my mother is from, where I was born, and I think I wanted to understand why it is that Mozambique is the way it is, right? The cultural mannerisms, what people are attracted to in sense of cultural aesthetics, why the city works the way it does, why the people work the way they do, or think the way they do. And for me, it was really reading through the literature, and the literature blew my mind. It was completely magical realistic. I always thought about magical realism as something very South American, but then I entered the Lusophone diaspora world, and then I was like, wow, these ideas are really incredible.
We're talking about these beautiful titles, that are they look like titles of books too. You know, you imagine a whole story behind it. You clearly are very much inspired by writers as well, and there's a strong narration component in single paintings, but also in the whole of exhibition. And I wanted to ask you whether there's a story to be read, you know, as an ensemble, or if there's one painting that you think that the specific story of that painting is something interesting for people to hear about.
The Equator's Forfeit. I think that painting really wraps up the mysticism around life, right? And African life and the world that we live in. It's complex, it's sometimes veiled. Like, for instance, like in African life, like they also have this notion, again going back to time, which maybe the equatorial line is also my understanding or my connecting to time, but they don't ever, there's a term in East Africa in Swahili called the Sasha and the Zamani. If I can recollect correctly, the Sasha is the current time and the Zamani is the limitless past. So there's no such thing as a future, because it hasn't happened yet, you know. So we're only dealing with the now, and we're dancing with the past. And actually, it is a duty to keep the past present, because then you lose culture, you lose ancestors. And I think in painting, the artist is also intermingling with this kind of thing, you know, because any painter is also referencing, any artist is referencing something that's been there. So in the Equator Forfeit, there's all of that, I think, encompassed in that painting. Time being this sort of elusive idea. There's romance, but then there's heartbreak. And I think it's also a little bit of a polarizing image.